welcome to From Another Angle, a Carnegie Council podcast. I'm Hilary Sutcliffe. I'm on the board of the Carnegie Council for AI and Equality. In this series, I get to talk to some of today's most innovative thinkers who take familiar concepts like democracy, human nature, regulation, or even the way we think about ourselves and show them to us from a quite different angle. What really excites me about these conversations I'm having is the way they challenge our fundamental assumptions. Certainly for me, and I hope for you too, their fresh thinking makes me see the world in a new way, and it opens up a whole raft of possibilities and ways of seeing and envisaging the future. Today, I am delighted to welcome David Robson, who is an award-winning science writer for the BBC, The Atlantic, Popular Science, and many more, and he specialises in the extremes of the human brain, body, and behaviour. We're going to talk about expectation from another angle. You may know a bit about the effects of positive expectations, like the placebo effect, or how negative expectations of our own abilities may be limiting. But in his new book, The Expectation Effect, which was a Financial Times Best Book of 2022, as well as a Sunday Times Best Paperback of 2023, and British Psychological Society Book Award for 2022, among many other accolades actually, David takes our understanding to another level with a scientific view of the mental and physical impact of our expectations, and he shares some truly astonishing examples of its life-changing effects. Today, we're also going to look beyond the book to reflect on how this understanding of the positive and negative implications of our expectations can be applied to some of the thorny problems of our day, how expectations may be limiting or powering our response to climate change, for example, or even tech development. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
Now, the idea of positive thinking has been around for decades, and manifesting is very popular right now. But this book is not like that at all. Perhaps you can start by talking us through what makes your book different from this other genre of self-help books.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I was very conscious of right from the beginning of writing the book was differentiating it from this kind of huge literature on positive thinking and then the recent trend in manifestation. I'm sure lots of people do find those kind of books useful, but a lot of it, in my opinion, is pseudoscientific. It's not really based on kind of really solid research, and it often draws on these ideas of the kind of cosmic law of attraction, where you're sending out positive energy and hoping that then you'll kind of draw positive things in as well. These writers might talk about that being this kind of effect from quantum mechanics, but I feel like they're misinterpreting the kind of laws of reality there. Whereas the expectation effect is very much grounded in good peer-reviewed science, and is looking at all of these very plausible mechanisms through which our mindsets really do have a powerful impact on our lives. And they do that through three main mechanisms. Our beliefs can create self-fulfilling prophecies by changing our perception, our behavior, and our physiology. And even though it can't perform like a miracle in the way that you might think that you can imagine yourself becoming rich and then lots of money just happening to come your way through something like a lottery win, actually the effects are still incredibly profound. So, my favorite example and the most powerful one that comes from the scientific literature is that your views of aging can shape how long you live. People who have a positive view of aging, who see old age as being a time for growth and opportunity, and they see their skills kind of crystallizing as they reach their 60s and 70s. They actually live for 7.5 years longer than people who have a negative view of aging, those who see it only as a time of decline and disability. And it's not magic. I'm not claiming that, they're actually kind of changing their DNA or something, but we do know that they are actually producing biological change here. We know that, the outlook you have of aging changes things like your stress response. And then day after day after day, those small benefits that you might have from the positive mindset actually accumulate, or conversely, the negative effects of always seeing your environment as being increasingly dangerous because you feel you're becoming more vulnerable, that actually accumulates, and then that can damage your tissues and predispose you to illness. So it's all, the mechanism here is very well documented. It's all through these pathways that we've known about for decades, and it's really just showing that actually it can all be held under this umbrella of mindset. And then by changing that mindset, you can switch from one mode of being to another and actually have those benefits of having that positive view. So that's just one example of the expectation effect, but I think that really encapsulates. I think that really encapsulates what I want to say about the expectation effect, which is that, it can be profound, but it's not some kind of miracle or magical. It's all grounded in very real science.
Well, I must admit, I'm a little bit nearer that aging end of the spectrum than you, David, but I can see that among my peers, who people really think they're on the downhill now. Luckily, I'm not one of those people. I'm going to be working till I'm 112. But also what I liked about your book too, and what I hadn't seen before, you talk about the mind as a prediction machine. So talk us through that scientific approach of how our mind uses what we find in the outside world to make predictions.
Yes, this is like the kind of theoretical bedrock of the expectation effect, I'd say. It really helps us to understand, why we evolved for expectations to shape our well-being in the way that they do, and it can help us to understand then the specific mechanics of the expectation effect. And essentially this theory, which has been gaining a lot of ground in neuroscience, is that the brain is constantly building these simulations of the world around us. Every second of every day it's doing this, and that's actually really important for shaping our perception, first of all, because the truth is that the sensory data that's coming, into our body is often quite poor. What we are seeing, that conscious experience of seeing, is not really a true reflection of the data that's hitting our retinas, because actually that can be very messy, very ambiguous, and the brain does a lot of processing to tidy it up. And it does so through these simulations that it's built. It has all of these past experiences of similar situations. It knows the context, which helps to refine those simulations. And then really it's using the data hitting your eyes to kind of just tweak the simulations. It's almost the simulations that we're experiencing rather than the real world. Some neuroscientists even go as far as to say that reality is really a controlled hallucination for this reason. Now, the fact is that these simulations, often are very accurate, but sometimes they can be wrong. Which is why we have those visual illusions that you might see, or why you might mistake something in your field of vision. You might mistake someone, a stranger, for a familiar person because of the expectation that you'd see them. Is wrong a fair amount of the time, but mostly it works very well. But what these simulations are doing, besides shaping our perception, is that they're also then changing our physiology, because we have to be very adaptive as animals. We have to respond to our circumstances, and those simulations are just helping you to predict what you need to do next. So how the body could prepare for a fight, or could prepare for the food that it's about to eat, could prepare for a period of starvation. And then that's, in turn, changing things like the hormonal balance within your body, the actions of the digestive system, your blood pressure, the actions of your immune system, whether you're going to be releasing lots of inflammatory molecules that can help to be the first line of defense against infection if you become wounded, for example. So all of this is happening. And, the prediction machine is working basically 24 hours a day. When we sleep, our dreams are actually a product of the prediction machine to a certain extent. But, especially, when we're conscious, our perception, our behavior, and our physiology is constantly being tweaked and changed and by this prediction machine. And so that's what we need to remember when we're thinking about the expectation effect, is that actually all we're doing when we think about the expectation effect is we're trying to optimize those simulations to make sure that they're actually working in the best way for us.
When I was reading the book, I was astonished by the physical symptoms that the expectation effect generates. This is not just about mindset necessarily. This actually results in changed physical symptoms. Give us some examples of that, because it was fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not imagined at all. I would really emphasize that, that we're not just telling ourselves that we're getting better and just feeling kind of happier because of that. We're actually seeing, in many cases, some real physiological changes. If you take a placebo painkiller, so a dummy pill that you believe to be, an opioid drug, for example, well, your brain actually starts to produce its own endogenous opioids. So we know that from brain scans, we know that from clever experiments where people have taken chemicals that actually block opioid signaling. And what you see is that when you block the opioid signaling, people no longer have the benefit of the placebo because they're not being able to benefit from those endogenous opioids being released. So, there's very strong evidence. I think that's very strong causal evidence that the expectations are actually changing your chemistry within your brain. But we know that's also true for lots of other symptoms that you might be experiencing. Things like inflammation, which is what basically leaves us feeling really poorly when we have an infection, is what causes, rashes to start to look very hot and angry. That is caused by these inflammatory molecules. And we know that actually, if you take a placebo that you think is going to reduce inflammation, then often it does actually reduce the levels of those inflammatory molecules. And conversely, if you expect to become sick, it can actually cause the body to kind of ramp up the production of those molecules as it prepares to fight some kind of infection. So, like you said, it's a very physical result that's coming from your subjective beliefs there.
I mean, to the point of death. Tell us the story that you use at the beginning of your book of the tribe who came over to America and the unexpected deaths that actually were psychological, not physical. Tell us.
Yeah, so these were immigrants from Laos, and they were moving to the US in the 70s and 80s, and suddenly the CDC in America started noticing that there was a really high proportion of deaths amongst the young men who had come over, much higher than you would expect for that age group. And, it was actually the leading cause of deaths for these young to middle-aged men. And it was a real medical mystery that they, in the middle of the night, they would just start gasping for breath, and then they would die of heart failure. And it actually took a medical anthropologist to find out kind of what was causing this. And she noticed, her name was Shelley Adler, she noticed that these men had carried a cultural belief, from Laos about this devil called the Dart So, who would visit people in their sleep and who would sit on their chest and suffocate them. Now, back in their homeland, these people would have been able to call on a shaman, or they could have performed certain rituals that would have protected them from the Dart So. But for these men in America, they lacked the kind of those cultural practices. They were integrating with American life, and they had left some of those behind. And that seemed to actually be then contributing to this state of panic that, when it was combined with an existing, genetic weakness in the heart, that was actually precipitating their deaths. And the idea was that these people could have lived with that, weakness in the heart for decades, but then the panic that was coming from this belief was actually, leading them to die a lot younger than they should have done. Now, I think a lot of the newspaper coverage at the time kind of spoke of, it was quite racist coverage, I would say, and it, was quite patronizing about these people, as if, as if we in the West don't have any irrational beliefs, when obviously we do. And actually there have been similarly, recorded cases of death through negative beliefs, amongst certain, people in the West as well. But actually what I think we really need to recognize is that actually so many of our beliefs, really widespread beliefs, are actually doing exactly the same thing. And one that I think is really relevant is our attitudes to stress in general. We've really been led to believe for about a century now, that stress is in itself debilitating and dangerous and must be avoided. So people are not only feeling the stress of their jobs, which is substantial, but then they're feeling a fear of that stress as well. And there are longitudinal studies suggesting that it's actually the fear of the stress that's then kind of amplifying the terrible effects of people's stress, and then leading, and it's that combination that's then leading to the cardiovascular disease and the heightened risk of death. You know, that's something that we think of as being total scientific proof that stress is dangerous, but actually stress can be dangerous, but it can also be enhancing. And it's very much our beliefs that determine which one is true. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy that I think we could really combat in the West.
And I like as well your approach looking at the reframing of stress from one perspective to another perspective, a more positive perspective, really has quite quick and profound implications for people.
It does. So, you know, when I talk about, you know, these kind of headline results, but actually there's a huge amount of evidence behind this on the short term and the long term. And, you know, to just give a few examples of the kind of short-term benefits of reframing your attitudes to stress. Scientists were looking at students taking a really difficult graduate records examination. You know, these students who were especially stressed about the maths component of that exam. And they just told these students that, you know, you will feel anxious probably in the exam, like that is natural, that your heart's going to be racing. You know, you might feel a bit short of breath, you know, like you're needing to bring in more oxygen. But you don't have to worry about that. That actually, that physiological reaction evolved for a reason. And that's because, you know, when the heart is racing, it's pumping all that oxygen to your brain and it's helping it to function, it's helping it to think more clearly. Similarly, you know, that feeling that your nerves are kind of jangling, that's coming from cortisol, which, you know, over the long term, if you have too high levels of cortisol, that can be damaging. But actually, you know, for a short-term event, it can be really enhancing to have that because it keeps you alert and makes sure that you're focused. No one wants to go into an exam being drowsy. And the researchers found that just teaching these students about those benefits actually then improved their performance. But also it then changes the kind of how people recover after the stress. And I think this is what's really important to remember. You know, it's not just about kind of doing well, but then it's also, it helps you to relax more quickly afterwards. So the cardiovascular system goes back to normal. You know, the body can start to divert more resources to things like digestion, you know, the rest and digest state, we call that. So you can just, you know, it can go back to doing the things it has to do to maintain your health. And it's through that kind of improved recovery that I think then the long-term benefits of having the more positive stress mindset comes in. Because if you're facing regular stressors with work, you know, it could be that you're having to do stressful meetings every day or meet tight deadlines. If you can isolate the stress to just that one moment in the day and then have lots of downtime where you can, you know, disconnect from it, you're not really going to have, you know, long-term health problems. But as if that's accumulating, if the levels of cortisol are staying constantly high day after day, month after month, then that's going to cause wear and tear to your organs that's eventually going to lead you to have a shortened lifespan. So, you know, I find this very compelling evidence. Now, I think we have the short-term interventional studies and then we have the long-term longitudinal studies, and they all tie together. They all point in the same direction, that our attitudes to stress are actually shaping how it affects our health and well-being.
What I loved about that chapter and that story as well is the power of explanations. I've done a bit of work on trust recently, and an explanation is a big driver of trust. And I'm working for a European Health Service, looking at how explanations matter between doctors and patients. And you've got a fantastic case study where you talk about how the explanations about what's going to happen with this drug, what's not, and explaining how they may feel transforms their life expectancy, the time in hospital. Could you just give us that case study?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's quite a few of these now, and I think this is, you know, I find it exciting because for decades, doctors knew about the placebo effect, but they didn't know how we could use it ethically, because you can't deceive a patient into thinking they're taking a real drug when they're not. But actually what you can do is, like you said, you just explain why the treatment is beneficial. So we saw this with people with extreme anemia, for example, who were receiving iron transfusions to boost their energy levels, and actually just explaining to them, why it was going to help, and to kind of show them, what they could expect to happen over the days ahead. That actually led them to have longer term benefits from that transfusion. They didn't need to go back so often to get it, because it was kind of helping to enhance their experience of that treatment. But the most profound case study, I think, came from Marburg in Germany, and that was looking at people who were recovering from cardiac surgery. So, as you can imagine, it's, very serious surgery, and lots of people have a huge amount of anxieties about what's going to happen, and actually they can often build the worst case scenario into their thinking. And the doctors kind of assumed that maybe that was actually going to harm their recovery for a negative expectation effect. So they gave half of their patients psychological therapy, just 4 sessions, an hour long each, where a health psychologist spoke to them about, kind of what their fears were, and then tried to kind of explain, well, actually, there might be this risk, but it doesn't need to be as bad as you're expecting. And then also explaining why the surgery was going to help them, physically, what was happening in the surgery, why that was going to improve the function of the heart. And then they set out this kind of plan for the next month of, when they might expect to reach certain milestones in their recovery. The other patients were just given treatment as usual, all of the good care that you would get in a hospital, but they weren't given this extra psychological help as well. And like you mentioned, these participants, these patients actually left hospital days earlier. A difference that in itself is enough to easily pay for the cost of the psychological therapy. If you consider how expensive it is to have a hospital bed, 4 hours of therapy is nothing in comparison. But, it's improving the patient's comfort in that short period of time. But then the benefits just kept on accumulating. So they had lower disability scores after the operation. They were able to go back to work more quickly, go on holiday, do all of the things that they wanted. And we even saw changes in their levels of inflammation within the body. And that's important, because actually, if you have too high levels of inflammation after an operation, that might actually make the healing a lot slower, could even undo some of the good that you're getting from the surgery. So in all these ways, the positive expectations were benefiting the participants. And the important thing was there was no deception there at all. It was really just giving them better understanding of what was happening in their bodies. Knowledge was power.
Astonishing. And as you say, a very cost-effective way of treating people for our strapped health services. Now, let's just look at it. Let's just move out for a second now, because one of the things reading your book, I was struck about the power of positive framing and negative framing. And obviously, with the Carnegie Council, we're looking at very large scale issues and the issues that are thorny problems of our age, like climate change and technology development. And it did strike me that when I read a lot of the articles that I read and LinkedIn and academic literature, it's all about describing the problem and catastrophizing the problem. The problems are, worth catastrophizing, let's be honest. I'm not minimizing the problems, but it struck me that there is a sort of, it's easier to talk about problems than it is about solutions. It's sort of, in our nature to do that, but there may be negative issues associated with that, not least a sort of fatalistic feeling that we just can't change anything. And I wondered if you could extrapolate your research into this sort of higher level thinking and see what you think is happening and what we could do differently in terms of expectations and communications.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think our expectations are hugely important in how we deal with the kind of big issues of the world, as well as, our personal challenges. And I say that thinking that we can't, ever minimize the kind of dangers that we're facing. With climate change, I think we have to be absolutely honest about the level of threat and, the timelines that we're looking at. If it is urgent, and we need to acknowledge that, like, people need to take, action as quickly as possible. And I don't think that kind of sugarcoating the message is going to help there. But I do think, in much the same way that with those patients, undergoing the heart surgery, you're not pretending that they're not going to experience discomfort or that it's not going to be difficult. The framing is really important still. And actually, like you said, we don't need to catastrophize too much. And by catastrophize, I do mean kind of that chain of thinking where it seems so fatalistic that there's simply nothing to do. And so that's where, with climate change in particular, I think there's emerging research showing that mindsets can be really important here. To give just one example, there's a long history of research in education about the growth mindset, and that's the idea that if people think that their abilities can improve incrementally with effort and with perseverance, that they actually deal with challenges a lot more proactively than people who have a fixed mindset. These are people who assume that any talents are completely innate, and they're not really going to get better through practice. And actually, if they face a failure, that's a real personal reflection on them, and it says something terrible about kind of their abilities and their inability to improve. That research has had some controversies, but I think in general it's well acknowledged now that it does bring lots of benefits to children to develop the growth mindset, even if it's not this kind of cure-all for all of education's problems, which it never could be. And we've also then looked at how that can be beneficial for people undergoing psychological therapy. For example, if you have a growth mindset about your personality and about your ability to regulate your emotions, you're more likely to benefit from cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety or depression. So, it can be applied in lots of different circumstances. And then this new research has actually looked at, well, how do people see the world around them? Do they see it as being this kind of fixed entity that, is never going to change? Like, we might, the details of the problems might change, but ultimately we're still going to have the same issues. Or do you see it as something that actually can get better over time? If we all work together as a society, can we make the world a better place? Can we tackle these big challenges head on? And what they found was that encouraging people to have that growth mindset about the world, to recognize that positive change is possible, to avoid that fatalistic fixed way of thinking, that actually did change people's attitudes to climate change. So first of all, it meant that they were more willing to accept the scientific consensus on climate change, but also then people were more willing to be proactive in the way that they personally would deal with climate change. And I find that very, optimistic. Like, I'm certainly not claiming that teaching people a growth mindset about the world is going to be the one and only solution to climate change. It's a very small piece of the puzzle, but nevertheless, I think when we're communicating about these risks, we do want to make sure that we bear this in mind. We don't want to reinforce that fixed mindset that's going to make people feel like they might as well just give up or turn away from the problem and try to pretend it's not happening. We want to try to get them to have that kind of growth mindset and to think about even small changes they can make that might over time kind of build up, even just with their voting intentions, that might make a change eventually to some much greater transformation. That's really where I stand on that.
Thank you, David. What a fantastic way to end. So could you give us a few pointers for our listeners of what they could do in their own lives and use the expectation effect to help themselves?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing that I would like to emphasize is that, whatever positive change we're trying to bring about, I'm not talking about having this kind of Pollyanna-ish view of the world as being this wonderful, rosy place where you deny all kinds of discomfort or challenges or stresses, or, we have to be realistic about the situation that we're in. But I think also we have to avoid this kind of idea that by being pessimistic, we're being inherently rational. I think there's this kind of idea that, defensive pessimism, but actually you're kind of smarter if you're always looking on the downside of things, because you're not going to be disappointed. We should really be aiming for this middle ground, I think. Like those people undergoing heart surgery, you can acknowledge the difficulties, but you can also then look at, the positive side of what's going on, or, just like reframing it so that you can see, so that you can set your expectations based on the evidence at hand. So you're just avoiding that extra level of stress and unhappiness that might be caused by the overly negative, catastrophic way of thinking. So, if you do find yourself maybe going in a downward spiral, there's just a few questions you can ask yourself. And it's always, am I being as objective as possible? Is there actually evidence for what I'm thinking? Is what I'm fearing inevitable? Or can I kind of look at it in terms of probabilities? Is there a positive outcome, a negative outcome, and a kind of neutral outcome? And, what are the relative weightings of all of those? And then finally, I just think treating ourselves with self-compassion is really important for applying the expectation effect. Now, there's a huge amount of research showing that we tend to be overly self-critical and to beat ourselves up all the time for our failings. And, we can learn from our failings, and we can recognize that feelings of disappointment are valuable. They're conveying useful information for how we might improve in the future. But we don't need to add to that distress by being like, nasty to ourselves. We should actually try to talk to ourselves as, a parent might to a child, or you might to a friend who's faced disappointment, being honest, but also being encouraging. And, whatever challenges you're facing and however you're trying to apply the expectation effect, I think that's important to bear in mind, to just be kind to ourselves.
Fantastic. What a great way to end. Thank you very much, David Robson. His book, The Expectation Effect, will be linked to underneath the podcast here, with some other sources of information and interest that he would like to share with us. So, David, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks for such fascinating discussion.